this chapter, we're going to take a look at some other things we can do by implementing hook form alter inside of our theme. We're also going to look at alternate ways for implementing hook form alter. And finally, we'll look at some things that probably shouldn't be done inside of a theme. For this example, I'd like to take a look at theming the user login form. So we're actually going to log out at the site. If I log out and then navigate to the login page by following any link to the login page on my site, or by simply just typing /user in the URL, I get the user login form. What I'd like to do is make some changes to this form. We're going to change it so that the label for the username field says name instead of username. So we'll start with that. The first thing we need to do is implement hook form alter and target the user login form. Back inside of our template.php file, we can print out this form ID variable in order to figure out which form we're targeting. Since I'm not logged into the site, I can't use the DSM or the KPR functions anymore. The devel module actually checks permissions when you use those functions to see if the currently logged in user has access developer information permission, and if they do, then it'll print the information out, and if they don't, it'll just skip it. Drupal provides a handy function named debug. We're going to use the debug function here to inspect the form ID variable and see what it contains as an anonymous user. So I'm just going to say debug and then form ID. If I click refresh, you'll see that it's now printing out the ID of that form. So the debug function works kind of like the DSM and KPR, but it's not quite as pretty. It doesn't give us the tree that we can click through for arrays, but it does give me the information I need. The unique ID of this form is user_login. This time, in our template.php file, instead of implementing hook form alter and saying if the form ID is equal to user_login, I'm actually going to implement a variant of the hook form alter function called hook form ID alter. I can look up the documentation for that on Drupal.org. And looking at the documentation, I can see that hook form ID alter allows me to perform a form alter on a targeted form. So all I'm going to do is implement this hook form alter exactly the same, but when I'm naming my function, I'm also going to include underscore and then the unique form ID. And that way, this function will only get called for that form. So back in our template.php file, now that we know the unique ID of that form, we can go ahead and remove the debugging code from this hook form alter. And then we can implement hook form ID alter. Implementations of hook form ID alter only take 2 arguments instead of 3. Just the form and the form state arrays. We no longer need the form ID because that's already assumed as part of the function name here. We don't need to check it and make sure that that's the form that we're altering. Once I've done this, I can go ahead and use the debug function to print out the form array, and we can inspect that. If I switch back to our site and click refresh, I'll now see the form array printed out from our implementation of hook form ID alter for the user login form. And right up at the top here, I can see is that username text field. What I'd like to do is change the label of that field. So I know that element inside of the form variable has a key of name, and then that element has a #title property of username. I'll go ahead and change that #title property so that it can be name instead of username, and we'll see that in action. I've added the code to change the title property of the name element to just name instead of username where it was before. I'm going to comment out our debug code temporarily, and I'll save this. And now when I refresh the page, you can see that I very easily changed the label of that field on this form. So that's another very powerful thing that you can do using hook form alter from the theme layer. The last thing I want to do is take a look at some of the things that you probably shouldn't do inside of hook form alter implementations. Because the hook form alter that we're implementing is at the theme level, and the theme level in Drupal is all about presentation, we want to make sure that we're not trying to change any behavioral aspects of the form inside of hook form alter. When dealing with hook form alter, we're getting the entire form array, and that array is not only a definition of what elements are going to appear on the page, but also how those elements behave. Things like validation handlers for an element, whether or not this field should be required. If it is required, what kind of content should it contain? When somebody clicks the submit button, what code should get triggered in order to save the values that were entered into this form or process those values? All of those things are part of that form array. We don't want to change those inside of our theme. And even if we try to, in most cases, it's not actually going to work. As an example of this, let's take a look at the Create a New Account page. I'm going to use this form instead of the user login form because the user login form in Drupal 7 outputs its error messages in a special way. It basically obscures all of the error messages that would normally say, username field is required or password field is required. And it just says the username or password is not recognized. It's trying to make sure that you're not actually trying to guess somebody's password or guess somebody's username. So we're going to implement hook form alter on the create a new account form. Inside of my template.php, I'll do the process of figuring out the unique form ID for that form. I'll use the debug function and print out the form ID variable inside of a just normal hook form alter here. Back on our site, when I click refresh, I can now see the unique ID for this form is user_register_form. I can use that information to implement a more specific version of hook form ID alter in our template.php file. So back in our template.php file, I can now comment out that debug code and create a new function. And I'm going to name it 960robots_form_ the unique ID of our form _alter. And just like before, that'll take 2 arguments. And then I can go ahead and print out that form variable and take a look at that. When I refresh the page, and I should see our form array printed out. There we go. That's the definition of this form. I can scroll through and start to look at it. And one of the things I'll see is this username text field. So inside of an element named account, we have another element with the key of name, and inside of that is this username text field. You'll notice one of the properties here is this #required = true. That's telling Drupal that this particular form element is required. Inside of hook form alter in our theme, I'm going to just simply change this to be false. So I can change form account name #required and set that to false. I'm also going to comment out this debug code. Switch back and refresh. When I refresh the page, it's not immediately obvious what's happened. But if you look closely, you'll notice that the red asterisk that used to be next to this username field is no longer there. Because we said #required = false instead of true. When Drupal tried to render the form to HTML, it got to that and said this element is not required. It's marked as #required false. So when I theme the HTML for this, I'm not going to print out this asterisk that normally marks a field as being required. So to the end user, it now looks like this username field isn't required. And I, as a user, might come along and say, oh, I'm going to skip this field. It's not required, but I'll go ahead and enter in an example here, or an email address into the email address field. I'll click create a new account, but I get an error. It doesn't let me. And you'll notice that one of those errors is you must enter a username. That's because this field, even though at the theme level we said #required = false, is still being required. The theme layer in this case is too late in the process to make any behavioral changes to the form. When the form is first displayed on the page, our hook form alter gets called, and we can change what things look like. We can also change that #required to false, and it'll display this field and make it look like it's not required. But then when the form's submitted, the theme layer is never actually invoked to process a form during submission. So our hook form alter isn't called when the form is submitted. So the form gets submitted. This field has no value, but it's marked as being required still because our form alter never got run. And so it's going to trigger an error on that form element. This is just an example of the kind of things that you probably want to not do inside of a hook form alter in your theme. Basically, themes are all about changing the presentation layer. If you wanted to change the functionality of a form, you'd want to use a module to do it.